In this episode, we look at the Malaysianization of the plantation industry and the obstacles that lay in Dato Henry's way. Henry, could we go on to the Malaysianization of all the companies in Malaysia, the time?
Yes. By the time I arrived in Malaysia in January 1971, just after the May 69 riots, there was, as you will remember, considerable discussion as to what needed to take place to ensure these should not be repeated. And this was the origin of the new economic policy. My relations in London had absolutely no understanding of Malaysian national aspirations. And my father and my uncle were inclined to rattle their telephones and ring the government and suggest that the warships be sent in if suggestions were made that things were not perfectly all right in Malaysia. It was really quite serious. Shades of Max Havelar's Multatuli, which was a novel written about the Dutch colonial operations 100 years earlier. And during the course of administering the rubber estate companies over the years, my father and my uncle had taken over in the early 1930s. And whenever a company had made a profit over and above what was required for dividends, they had arranged for the excess profits to be invested in one of the other company's shares. So over the years, they had created a financially impregnable spider's web of companies which all held each other, so that any form of takeover for the smaller companies was impossible. My father, however, had gone on the acquisition trail in the late 50s and early 60s and had built up the Highlands and Lowlands company so that it was far, far larger than the others. So when the new economic policy came in, I found myself as the youngest member of the family and the least experienced in the hotspot in Malaysia, trying to explain to my relations, who were all many years older than me in London, that they couldn't simply roll up the rubber estates and take them to Sumatra, and therefore they better move to comply with what seemed to me to be a not unreasonable requirement of the new economic policy to ensure that Malaysian assets were majority held by Malaysians. And on the other hand, I was dealing with a number of, again, much older, highly nationalistic Malaysians, headed by Tun Ismail Ali, who I got to know quite well, who would not believe me when I told them that I was having difficulty persuading my colleagues in London that we had to move to comply with the new economic policy. However, after a fairly short space of time, I came to realize that there was one way of getting a message across to the Malaysian authorities which would be believed, and that was if they heard me relating that message on the international telephone calls which I had to make to my colleagues in London. So if I wanted to get a message across to the Malaysian authorities, I made a point of having an international call to London. We were very lucky in the case of Highlands and Lowlands in that there were two independent outside directors. One was Sir John Saunders, who had previously been chair of HSBC worldwide, and the other was a cousin of mine called Charles Denman, who did actually understand the requirements of the new economic policy, and it was not an unreasonable way to go. And conclusive proof that the authorities were tapping into my international telephone calls came on the night when anybody who'd been listening regularly would have realized that on that particular evening, my father was going to indicate on the phone whether he was prepared to take the merchant banker's advice to move the tax residence of Highlands to Malaysia and thereby Malaysianize it, or whether he was going to dig his toes in. In those days, of course, one had to go through an international operator. And that evening, when I rang the international operator, the phone was answered after half a ring. "That's Mr. H.S. Barlow. You want a reverse charge call to Mr. T.B. Barlow at Mansion House 1243, don't you?" And I was through in 15 seconds. So we managed to get the Highlands group of companies moved tax residence for the first year, and then we reincorporated here in Malaysia in the second year. That left the spider's web of cross-held smaller companies, which my father and my uncle were absolutely determined to hold on to. And we appeared to be in something close to a logjam. However, at this time, you may remember the weekly newspaper, which was read by most businessmen in Southeast Asia, was the Far Eastern Economic Review produced in Hong Kong. And I happened to have come across one of the leading journalists there, a man called Hugh Payman. And he had asked me on several occasions about what was going to happen with these companies. And I said, look, I'm not in a position to give you inside information. That will be completely wrong. However, I will give you all the information which otherwise will take you 3 weeks to gather from company records and documents lodged in Companies House in the UK. And you can write an article and draw your own conclusions from that article, which he did, concluding that something very nasty was going to happen to the remaining companies in the Thomas Barlow and Brother Secretariat unless they moved very rapidly to comply with the new economic policy. And that appeared on my father's and my uncle's desk and on the desk of one of the independent outside directors in London. And at that stage, my relations realized that they really had to do something. It was interesting that it required me to put up a journalist to write an article before they were prepared to listen. You perhaps won't be surprised to hear that as a result of that, my relations with my father in particular and the rest of the family were under very considerable strain, and relations with my father never really fully recovered after that, which was very sad, but there it was.
But why did he put it upon you that was, well, like as if you were to be blamed? It was just a policy that you couldn't get out of anyway.
Well, he didn't understand. He didn't realize that he and his brother had worked all their lives to build up what they thought was an impregnable financial edifice out of these different companies, but they had completely failed to take into account political changes and political pressures which could and were exerted on the basis that you simply can't move the estates out of Malaysia somewhere else. And when the independence of Malaya, of the Federation, was announced in 1957, they were so disapproving that they put their heads together and said, we think as a matter of security, we ought to invest in somewhere which is going to remain British for the foreseeable future. And they bought a block of flats in Salisbury, southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. So while I was involved in Malaysianization of the British quoted companies, Holloway was doing his PhD. He worked with the Commonwealth Agricultural Bureau, which involved spending half an hour a day identifying endless duplicates of pest species from all over the world. But when he wasn't doing that, he was working on his life's work, which was the 18 volumes of the moths of Borneo, covering about 5,000 species of the macro moths.
I hope you have found this episode engaging, and see you at the next one.